Right, we're learning about forms of business ownership, right? We talked about how even though sole proprietorships make up the majority of the businesses in the US, they only bring in a small fraction of the sales revenue. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's hard to grow a sole proprietorship. Who remembers what makes it difficult to grow a sole proprietorship?
You don't have the support.
Don't have the support of a big corporation, right? And so what gives corporations the advantage?
They don't have like one person's not doing it.
You're on the right track. It's true, corporations do tend to be bigger and they have more employees and that helps them grow. But how do they get there? How do they fund getting that big in the first place? Exactly. They're able to raise money by selling stock, right? Or issuing bonds. Those are two ways that corporations can go out there and raise money to help them grow. But sole proprietors cannot do that. They cannot sell stock. They cannot issue bonds. You have to be a corporation to do that. Only corporations can sell stock. Government entities can sell bonds, but and then we also talked about partnerships. They have their own inherent problems. So you see, they also do not have that much of the sales revenue, and they only make up a small portion of the businesses in the US. So partnerships exist for a specific reason. They do make sense in certain situations, but they're really not that popular of a form of business ownership because of some of the problems inherent in partnerships. So again, a sole proprietorship means that there's one owner, or in some states, perhaps a married couple. But that's it. No investors. And so the owner has complete liability for the actions of the business or the debts of the business. And that unlimited liability is one of the major drawbacks. You couple that with the fact that they can't sell stock or issue bonds, so it's hard for them to raise money other than just through selling their product or service. And that explains why sole proprietorships usually stay fairly small. So then why are they so popular? Why are there so many sole proprietorships if it's hard for them to get really big? They're easy to start. As I mentioned on Tuesday, you really don't have to do anything special. You just start doing business and then you're a sole proprietor, right? As opposed to a partnership where you and your partner have to agree on how you're going to operate the business, how you're going to split the profits, what you're going to do if one of the partners wants to leave. All of that has to be agreed upon, which really means you want to work with a lawyer that knows how to write up the contract, the partnership agreement. So there's more effort and cost involved in forming a partnership. I mentioned that there are general partners and limited partners. What was the difference between a general partner and a limited partner?
General is going to be for everybody or everyone, general. But the limit is going to be just for a few people, like limited.
Limited is what part of the you are part of the limited, like you can have limited liability. It's not case when you is gonna part just a part or no the liability for you.
Okay,
You can
so
or you can invest.
Yeah.
Just invest in the company, but you don't work in the company.
So this gets a little confusing because we see limited and we see limited liability, right? So when you limit your liability, you're protecting yourself against potential financial obligations of the organization. But before we get to limited liability, we just have limited versus general in terms of categories of partners. And the basic difference is a general partner is involved in managing the partnership, and a limited partner is not involved in managing the partnership. So that's the fundamental difference.
Okay, okay.
In a general partnership, all of the partners are involved. They're all general partners. In a limited partnership, you have at least one partner that is involved in managing the business, a general partner, and you have at least one limited partner who's not involved in managing the business. But then we get into limited liability, and this is where you then try to shield yourself. So you say, if the business or if one of my partners gets sued or has some financial liability, it's not my problem. I don't have to pay for that. So that's what the idea of limited liability is. And that gets kind of complex. As we see here, we have limited liability partnerships or LLPs. Oftentimes, when you see the name of a law firm, after that it'll say LLP. Well, lawyers understand the law, right? So if you're setting up a law firm partnership, they're going to try to protect themselves legally. They'll set it up as an LLP or even an LLLP, right? Which gives them even more protection. It gets complicated, and I'm not a lawyer, so we'll just kind of leave it at that. But I would say the main thing to consider or to keep in mind is a general partner manages the business, a limited partner just puts in money, but does not get involved in managing the business. They're more like an investor. And then, as I mentioned, partnerships can be problematic because if the partners don't agree on things, the only way to change partners is to dissolve the partnership. If you want to add a partner, or if you want to remove a partner, legally you have to dissolve that partnership and then create a new organization. Which happens, it's not impossible to do that, but it's a bit of a hassle. So if you are thinking of going into partnership with somebody, think really carefully about what that means. Why do I think this is the right form of business ownership, right? Why do I want to be kind of legally married to this person in this business relationship? Is that really the best relationship? And if it is, think really carefully about the agreement, what each party is promising to do, what happens if something goes wrong, all of that you want spelled out clearly in the partnership agreement. Any comments or questions on partnership? Probably tell I kind of have a bias against them in general. I don't think they work out well for most people. They do work well under certain circumstances. But what I find is students often think, oh, if I have a business, I want it to be a partnership because it sounds nice. But you can partner with other people without legally having a partnership. There are other ways to involve people in your business. You can hire them. You could have them be a supplier for your business. You could have them be an investor or a lender. They don't necessarily have to be legally a partner. And then we get to the corporation. So as I mentioned, we have this kind of wall that protects the investors. Like a limited partner, the investors just put money in and hope to get money back. They do not get involved with the operations of the business. They do get to vote on the board of directors, and once in a while there will be something specific that they'll get to vote on. But in general, that's it. All the stockholders can do is vote. The board of directors is not employees necessarily, but they oversee the organization. And they can hire the CEO, they could fire the CEO and the other executives as well. So even though they operate sort of in the background, and they're not employees, they really have more power than anybody else in the organization. And then we've got the executives that are actually running the organization, who have this, as I explained on Tuesday, they've got this pressure to make more profits. And in fact, they get rewarded with more stock and a higher stock price if they make more profits, right? So the investors are all, I mean, the executives are all focused on increasing profits. And sometimes they're so motivated to increase profits, they do things that they really shouldn't do. They act in ways that might be unethical or illegal. And they know that they could go to jail. It's rare, but there are times when executives go to jail. The Enron case is a classic example. I might have mentioned it before, but both the CEO and the CFO of the company were found guilty of crimes and in their role running the company. And the CFO went to jail, and the CEO would have gone to jail if he hadn't died first. But that's very rare. So a lot of executives know that they can get away with doing bad things and probably not ever serve any jail time. In fact, usually the worst that could happen is their company gets fined. They're like, no big deal. We broke the law, we made $10 million, and we got a fine of $300,000, right? And so it's very common, unfortunately. So we have this situation where the investors want to see profits. So through the board of directors, they're pressuring the executives to make more profits. And the executives are the only ones who might get punished. Even if the executives do get sentenced to jail, the investors are safe. All they did is they just put in their money, right? So we have this inherent system that's really founded on greed, really founded not just on making a profit, not just on building a company, but trying to milk as much profit as you can, right? So that the executives make the biggest bonuses they can, just so that the investors make money. And the investors are never held accountable. And I don't think they necessarily should, right? If you're an investor, you shouldn't go to jail because of something the company did. But there has to be some way to increase accountability and deter these executives from doing things that are illegal, for sure, and doing things that are considered by society to be unethical. We talked about how ethics is a subjective thing, right? We all have different views. So it's a little harder to hold somebody accountable for doing something you believe is unethical. Maybe they feel it was ethical. But at least we should hold them to the law. Right now, in the Supreme Court, today, there are arguments going on about whether or not a president of the United States should be held criminally accountable for the things that they do while they're serving in office. There's a lot of debate about, well, what if they're doing it in the office of the president and in the role of the president? Well, it's pretty much agreed that they should not be held criminally liable. But what if they're doing it for personal reasons, like to get reelected? And then how do you draw the line between those two? And it's a very complicated argument. But I think we would all agree a president telling people to lie so that they can get reelected, telling people to cheat on an election so that they can get reelected, should be criminal, right? I mean, who would think that that would be something we would want presidents to do? And it's a similar situation here. how do we hold the powerful in our society accountable? And in some ways, some of these executives are more powerful than the president of the United States. Right? Think about Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Meta. I think he's still CEO. Or the CEO of Google, or the CEO of Apple. These are multinational corporations, right? They have a lot of influence, not just in the US, but all around the world. And if they break laws, or if they do things that society feels are unethical, how do we hold them accountable? So this is an inherent flaw in our system. Now, our American system that is capitalist leaning, as we've discussed, it's led to a lot of great innovation, right? We're still a great democratic nation, despite some of the challenges to our democracy. We're still the wealthiest, or at least one of the wealthiest nations in the world, right? So we're doing a lot of things right, but we have a lot of issues too, right? And a lot of those issues we could trace back to corporate greed. And where does corporate greed come from? The fact that people can invest money in a corporation, pressure that corporation to do things that are not good for society, and they benefit financially in many cases, and they're never held accountable, right? So, so that is the power and the maybe ethical issues surrounding corporations. We talked about how you form a corporation. We talked about the pros and cons of sole proprietorships versus partnerships versus corporations. I think this probably is worth a quick review, and then we'll be ready to move on. So for a sole proprietorship, if you're the owner, you get to keep all the profits. There's not a lot of cost or complexity to getting your business formed. And you get to work independently. If you're a partnership, also fairly easy to form the business. If you're a corporation, the investors have limited liability, right? As I was just discussing in detail. It's easy to issue stock and raise money, right? That's an advantage to corporations. When we get into disadvantages, corporations have double taxation.
Why
Where
is
did
legal?
that, what was that?
Why not is illegal to do double taxation? Why not? Because you really pay, or you need to pay again.
Well, okay. So Karina's question, very, very good question. Why is it not illegal for there to be double taxation? Well, two different entities are getting taxed. The corporation is getting taxed, and the investor is getting taxed.
You already paid taxes for his money.
If you think about it, I mean, that's not the only case where multiple parties are getting taxed along the way, right? We could, let's say we as a society decided to change that and not tax investors on their dividends. Well, that would cause more people to invest money because they know that anything that they earn through the dividends or through selling the stock, which is called a capital gain, they wouldn't get taxed on. Okay, so if we did that, yes, it would cause more people to invest. Is that going to be good for society? I'm not an economist. I would think it would further exacerbate the existing situation where we've got a small number of Americans that even invest, and then the vast majority that can't afford to invest. So it would really help the investor class. Let's say we continued to tax the investors, but we got rid of corporate taxes so that you didn't have to pay tax on your profits if you're a corporation. Who's that going to help? Again, the wealthy, the executives, and the investors. So I think the way it's designed helps limit the ability of the wealthy to become super wealthy.
Okay.
to me, as a non-economist, it seems to me the wealthy in general are often not paying their fair share. If
But
anything,
if you start your investment,
uh,
you're gonna need to pay, but you have lack of money.
say it
You're
again.
gonna, if you start to get investment,
Mhm.
you start like starting like your investment, you have to pay the dividends.
Okay, so as an investor, okay, so here's, let me just clarify a couple points here. So if you buy stock, some stock doesn't pay dividends at all, and you would only pay taxes when you sell that stock, and only if you made a profit. If you buy a stock that does pay dividends, whether or not you have to, well, when you have to pay taxes depends. If it's stock that's within a retirement plan that you have set up, then you might not have to pay taxes until you retire and you start taking that money. So there are all these loopholes, right? There are all these ways that the wealthy can get around paying taxes. And we have corporations that earn billions of dollars but don't pay any income tax. Is that right? Is that fair? You know, they say, oh, well, actually these profits were not made in the United States because we have this company in Ireland, and we actually, you know, bought from our sister company in Ireland, so we will pay taxes in Ireland. And they do that to get around paying taxes in the US. Happens all the time.
That's just not good.
What's that?
That's not good.
It's not good, right? It's not good. If corporations and the wealthy paid their fair share of taxes, it would help our overall economy, right? Okay, so, so double taxation is a downside of corporations. And they do have increased government regulation on corporations. Downsides of partnerships, again, it's hard to just add or take out a partner. You have to reform as a new organization. And the potential of conflicts between partners is a major issue. With sole proprietorships, the unlimited liability of the owner, the fact that they are completely responsible for whatever happens with the business, is a downside, and that's it. So that's everything we've covered on Tuesday. What questions or comments do you all have? Aaron?
The board of directors serve in multiple companies.
Yeah, you could be on the board of multiple companies. I'm sure there are probably some restrictions, like if they're competitors, that would probably be a conflict of interest, right? But if they're in completely separate industries, I think that would be fine. And I do know there are people that serve on multiple boards.
Can companies get like tax write-offs if they plus like military stuff or like?
Well, it's really, you know, the federal government that funds the military, right? But can you give me an example so I can?
I don't know, I'm just saying, like, say, Costco bought like a bunch of tanks or something, they like maybe use that as tax.
What would they do with the tanks? Okay. Yeah, if you give money to a charity, a nonprofit, you can get a tax deduction. Now, let's say you donate $1 million to a charity as a corporation, and you're in a, I don't know, 20% tax bracket, then that saves you $200,000. So you donated $1 million and it only saved you 200,000. So it doesn't even save you as much money as you donate, right? So tax write-offs are useful, but you would never make a donation just for the purpose of getting a write-off because it costs you more than you get back. I can't think, like, let's say Costco decided they wanted to go out and purchase tanks for themselves. They could do that, I guess, and there might be laws against it, I don't know. But if they can say that that's a business expense, they get a write-off. But again, it wouldn't save them as much money as they spent. If they said, we're going to sell tanks. Again, I'm sure there are laws about that as well. But then it's just like any other cost that a product would be bought. So, yeah, basically, military funding goes through the government, and a private company or even a publicly traded corporation wouldn't get involved. Now, okay, if you make tanks, right? If you're a company that makes tanks, you're getting paid by the government, right? And there's very little oversight. For some reason, the Pentagon, which is, represents all the military branches, does not get audited. Nobody audits their books to see if they're spending the money properly. I don't know why that is. I think we should probably audit the Pentagon, but anyways, we don't. And so there's all this money that goes to the whole defense industry, right? Where our tax dollars is getting used to buy missiles and things, which sometimes are necessary for defense, but sometimes it just happens because some congressperson wanted to keep that military contractor happy in their community and create jobs for the local population. So we have this whole military industrial complex. Not my phrase. I believe Eisenhower referred to that back in one of his speeches back in the 50s. And he said, Eisenhower was a general before being president. He was, I believe, a war hero from World War II and a Republican. And he stood up there in front of the nation and said, we need to be careful of the military industrial complex, the defense contractors that can make big money from war. We don't want to be starting wars just because we have all these businesses that want to sell tanks. So it's a big issue, but I don't see any way that you could basically get a tax write-off for buying military products. All right. Other questions or comments? We'll get Noah and then back to Jade.
About C corporations, but we talk about S corporations.
We will. Yeah, I'll get to that. I think maybe on the next slide. So yeah, we'll get there. And Jade?
Do we have like a lot of politicians that are, I guess, like stockholders in big companies?
Yeah.
Like the involvers.
Yes. So it used to be a major problem because these investors can buy stock and sell stock, right? But if they know something about the business, about the company that the public doesn't know, it's not really fair for them to be buying or selling stock because of something that they know and the public doesn't know. If you do that, it's called insider trading, and it's illegal. It happens all the time, but it is illegal. In fact, that's what Martha Stewart had been accused of. That was a famous case. So if, like, let's say you work for a company, maybe you're an executive, and you know that the company is about to get sued, and you think you're going to lose that lawsuit. And so you think, I better sell all my stock right now. Well, you're not supposed to do that because you're acting on information that the public does not have, and that's not fair. Again, it happens all the time, but it's illegal. Now, what if you're a member of Congress that's passing laws, and you know you're about to pass a law that's going to cause this company to lose money? And so you sell your stock in that company before that law passes. It should be illegal, right? Congress should not be able to profit off of the things that they know as Congress people, right? Because the rest of us don't have access to that information. Now, there was a law that made that more difficult so that Congress couldn't do that. From what I understand, that law has been weakened over time, and there are Congress people taking advantage of their position, and they're making a whole bunch of money because of inside information the rest of us don't have. And that I think is wrong. Yeah. Not an expert on that area, so I can't give you details, but From what I understand, that sort of thing is going on. Okay, and I said we would get to S corps. And yes, on this slide, in fact, that's the very next thing, S corps. So there are different types of corporations. I think I've mentioned that nonprofit organizations, if they want to not pay taxes on their income, they have to be a nonprofit corporation. And they have to be approved by the IRS in order to not have to pay income taxes. So that's one type of corporation, a nonprofit corporation. Another type is a C corporation, and C corporations are the big ones. The ones that are publicly traded on stock exchanges are C corps. You could also have an S corp or a B corp. Those are two other types. An S corp is limited to 100 investors. So you can go out there and get investors, but it's a limited amount. And S corps are not traded on stock exchanges, so it's only private investors that you can involve in your S corp. So why would you do that? Why would you go through the hassle of forming a corporation if you were only going to have less than 100 investors? In fact, some S corps have only one investor. The founder of the company might be the only owner of stock in that corporation. Why would you go through that process of forming an S corp and have only one investor or a small number of investors? So you get that limited liability, right? Where you can say, this corporation, this S corp, is separate from me. And sure, you can sue that S corp,
Pero no me.
but not me. Sure, you can take that S corp's assets that it owns, but you can't take mine.
That's good.
Now, sometimes a judge will say, nice try, but it's clear that you set it up that way just to get around responsibility, and the way you ran the corporation was negligent, and we are going to hold you personally responsible. That's called piercing the corporate veil. It does happen, but in general, when you set up an S corp, you do get that limited liability. And so they do exist. A B corp is different. B stands for benefit. And the idea with a B corp is you're creating a corporation that wants to make a profit, but it also wants to provide a benefit to society. And so you're willing to give up some of your profits in order to provide more benefit to society. And so then your investors know going in that you're not just about profits. You're also about doing something good. And so that will only attract investors that are okay with giving up some profits in exchange for more benefit to society. And that's, again, called a B Corp. They're not super common, but if you look at like health food products, they will often, if you look closely on the packaging, you'll see a B for B Corp somewhere. That tends to be where you find those. Patagonia, if you're familiar with that business, they're a B Corp. In fact, they were the first B Corp in California, and they are committed to upholding a high standard of ethics and social responsibility. So Patagonia is a pretty interesting company. So that's S Corps and B Corps. And there are also limited liability companies, LLCs. Those are fairly popular. They are easier to start. They're less expensive, for example, than starting a corporation, and easier to maintain. The filing and everything is not that difficult. For an LLC in the state of California, the fee is $800 a year. So, you know, it's not that bad. It provides that limited liability for the owners. Now, with an LLC, you can have a maximum of 10 owners. Those owners are called members for some reason. I don't know why. Here we see an example of an LLC and a certificate of membership showing that somebody is one of the owners. So you can have up to 10 members. They limit their liability, again, to protect their own personal assets. And it's fairly easy to get it started and to do the annual filings. So that is an option. Questions or comments? All right, let me cover this one more slide, then we'll do our grow activity. Another option for a form of business ownership is a cooperative. And a cooperative is owned by multiple people. So in some ways, it's kind of like a corporation or a partnership or an LLC in the sense that you have multiple owners. These are not very common in the US. There are some cooperatives. For example, when my daughter was going to UC Santa Barbara, there was a food co-op in Isla Vista, which is right next to the campus. And she joined the food co-op because when you join, you become part owner, you get to vote on some of the decisions, and you get a discount when you shop there. Oh, but in exchange, you have to do some volunteer work at the co-op, or there might be an option where you pay a certain amount instead of volunteering. But it's kind of neat because it gives people the opportunity to be part owner in a local business. That is an example of a buyer cooperative because the owners were people that buy products through the co-op. But you can also have a seller's cooperative. So imagine you've got a farm and it's a small farm and you're finding it difficult to compete because the big grocery companies don't want to deal with a small farm. And you even go to some of the local brokers and say, hey, will you represent me and sell my crop to the grocery stores? And they don't even want to talk to you because your farm is too small. So you partner up with a bunch of other small farms in your area and you form a cooperative, and now it would be a seller's cooperative. So now you put all your crops together and now you can get the attention of the brokers and the grocery stores. That would be a seller's co-op. Now there's a region of Spain, the Mondragon region, where they've been using co-ops for decades, many decades, very successfully. And some of them have grown to be billion-dollar companies that are collectively owned, which is kind of neat. The people that work there are part owner. People in the community are part owner. Why has this concept not taken off in the US? What are your thoughts? Why do you think we don't have very many cooperatives here in the United States? Does it kind of sound like communism? Shared ownership of a business, you know? It's like a kibbutz in Israel. It's a shared farm. Or think about in the Soviet Union, they had these collectively owned farms. And the US has been very afraid of communism because we've seen what happened in the Soviet Union and other parts of the world where communism led to totalitarianism, right? And a lot of people died and starved, and we don't want that. So anything that sounds like communism or even socialism, Americans have been afraid of, right? We're kind of warming up to certain socialist concepts, but cooperatives sound too communist. But there's another reason too. I once heard a talk by a professor from Princeton, and she explained that there was a time when communities of color in the United States looked at cooperatives as a solution. That in their communities, you know, they'd have to go to the local grocery store or the hardware store and spend their money. But those profits were going to the owners of those stores who did not live in that community, who were probably, you know, wealthy white people. And so their money is all going out of the community. And they said, you know, let's form cooperative businesses where we own the hardware store We own the grocery store. And that way the profits stay in our community and help grow our community. So that was seen as a solution by many communities of color. This would have been like the earlier part of the 20th century, but laws were passed in some of those communities to make that more difficult, so that these communities could not economically empower themselves through collectives or cooperatives. So I think that association with communist ideology, racism, both played a hand in making it so cooperatives are just not a common form of business ownership in the US. But they do exist, they can be successful. They're not right for every organization, but they might be the right choice in some cases. Now, the last form of business ownership is one we've actually talked about before, joint ventures. This came up in chapter 3. This would be when two companies decide to work together, and so they form a third company that they both share ownership in. And this would be pretty common if you're going to be doing international business. So if you're going to open up business in China and your company is based in the United States, you might want to partner with a Chinese company that understands the laws and the language and the culture, right? And then what you might do is form a business in China where they're part owner and you're part owner. In fact, I think in China, you're kind of required to do that. They don't let foreign companies just come in and set up shop. So that would be a joint venture. Okay. So we've discussed many forms of business ownership. Any questions or comments at this point, Jay?
How would a company like TikTok be working since they're from like a foreign place?
Yeah,
Government involvement?
exactly. Yeah, so the parent company of TikTok is ByteDance, right? That is a Chinese company. Now, I believe the way they're structured, well, okay, I'm not exactly sure. They probably have a US business that's owned by the Chinese business. That's typically how it works. Like, for example, when I worked at Nintendo, well, Nintendo is a Japanese company. I worked for Nintendo of America that was owned by Nintendo of Japan. So that's typically how it works. So the parent company of TikTok is a Chinese company. It's believed that the Chinese government is very involved in that business and has a lot of control. And that's why it's concerning that TikTok users' data is accessible to the Chinese government. And they could use that against American citizens. They could use it like by trying to radicalize people, by sending them certain messages. They could try to market to us. And we don't want foreign governments to have that kind of knowledge and influence on us. So that's where the big debate is right now about whether or not the ownership of TikTok by a Chinese company that's linked to the Chinese government, whether or not that should be allowed. And it looks like, actually a law was just passed, wasn't it? Giving a certain amount of time that the Chinese ownership of TikTok needs to sell to an American company. Now, American companies can do the same thing. They can also sell our data, use our data, manipulate us, but at least it's an American company doing it, I guess. I don't know. So does that answer your question? Okay. It's a whole can of worms, right? I don't know where it's going to go, but it's a much bigger problem, right? The whole, what is an American company versus a Chinese company? You know, there are American companies that are probably having ties to the Chinese government, right? And nothing wrong with China as a nation, but their government does some things sometimes that are not in the interest of the United States. Okay. Other questions or comments? All right, so before we get into franchising, let's go ahead and do our grow activity. So I'm going to pause recording here, get into your groups. Okay, so right now we're going to talk about franchises. Is a franchise a form of business ownership? The answer is no. So what is a franchise? It's a relationship between two parties. You've got the franchisor and the franchisee. So the franchisor is the parent company, like McDonald's Corporation. The franchisee would be the independent business person that wants their own McDonald's location. So they could enter into a relationship with the franchisor to say, hey, I will operate a local McDonald's. Just train me. Here's my application. Here's my $1 million I need to invest. Let me open up a local McDonald's. Okay. So that's the way it works. We have a list here. This is from Entrepreneur Magazine. Back probably 2017, this was produced. This was Entrepreneur Magazine's list of the top 10 franchises. Now, I don't know how they came up with this list, but they felt like these were the top 10. And these are probably all companies you've heard of before, right? They're pretty popular chains, and they all operate as franchises. So that means anybody, if they have enough money and meet the qualifications, could open up their own 7-Eleven, their own McDonald's, their own Dunkin' Donuts, etc. That doesn't mean it's the right solution. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons of being a franchisee. But that is the basic idea. And you see that it could cost anywhere from $37,000, which is probably, if you're out in the boonies somewhere where nobody really wants to open up a 7-Eleven because they're not going to get a lot of business and you don't want to live out there necessarily. Maybe some people like living in the boonies, like way out in the desert or something. Some people like that. But most people maybe prefer to be closer to the coast or closer to our, urban populations. So you might also have to spend as much as $1.6 million to open up a 7-Eleven, again, based on the location and other factors. A McDonald's, it's going to take an investment of $1 million plus. So why would somebody choose this route? Because you could start your own restaurant, right? Why try to become a McDonald's franchisee instead of just opening your own? What would be the benefit of being a franchisee?
Because you have the name of the brand and the prestige of the brand, right? You have
Exactly.
your customers already.
There's brand recognition. People already know McDonald's. They know what to expect when they walk into a McDonald's, right? There's a menu that's already developed. There are systems, there are prices, there's marketing. All of the stuff is already prepared for you, which sounds great. But there could be a large upfront cost to get started. You have to follow their rules. You have to share some of the profits with them. So it's not all positive, right? There are pros and cons. You have a better chance of success, of making a profit with a franchise than you do with a startup, because with the startup, you don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. People don't know you, right? They don't know your business or your brand. So it's generally safer to go the franchise route. But the potential rewards are limited, and the costs can be pretty high. Now, this is just one list of top franchises. If we go to the next slide here from Franchise Business Review, they came up with their top 10 list. These companies are not nearly as well known, but less expensive to get started with. You only need 100,000 or so. And here's another list from Franchise Gator. They came up with their top 10 franchises. Again, not as well known. Now, if you're thinking franchising might be the way you want to go, okay. I'll share with you quickly as an experience one of my sisters had as a franchisee. So she and her husband decided they wanted to start their own business. They decided they wanted to open a gym. And instead of starting from scratch, they wanted to be franchisees. So they researched, they talked to different companies, they settled on Anytime Fitness, which, you know, in general, it's a good company. I'm a member of Anytime Fitness myself, so I, you know, I can say they seem to run pretty good operations. And my sister was down in Southern California. She applied to become an Anytime Fitness franchisee. As I recall, she and her husband had to go for a week worth of training. You know, after they'd gotten approved, they had to put in some money. They had to find a space. They did purchase an existing franchise. So there was another franchisee in the area that was getting out of the business. And so they were able to buy the customers that person had. But they had to find their own location somewhere in that same area. They had to buy all the equipment, you know, they had to hire the employees, train everybody. So a lot of the same things they would do with their own business, right? But they got it open and the customers started coming in. And what they found was sometimes people quit their gym membership for different reasons. They moved, they lost their job. So you're constantly having to find new members to replace the old members that left. And that's just to maintain, right? If you want to grow your gym, you have to market and attract even more people. So my sister ran it for a couple of years, realized she wasn't making any money, and it was basically like a full-time job where she wasn't getting paid. And so she eventually said, I'm done. And so she wanted to get out. So she had to find somebody that would buy it from her. She had to find a new franchisee. And that person would have to qualify, would have to have the money and the ability to become a franchisee. So she found finally a married couple that wanted to take it over. Make sure I'm not, okay, I better make this quick. So long story short, this couple took it over. They could not get a loan. If they'd been able to get a loan, that loan could have paid my sister off and she would have been done with it. They couldn't get a loan. My sister said, no problem, you just pay me directly, over time. Well, the couple takes it over. They end up getting a divorce. They stop making payments. The gym shuts down. They end up just taking all the equipment and selling it. And my sister did not get all the money she was supposed to get. At least she was not under the lease anymore. She wasn't responsible for paying, I don't know, it was like $5,000 or $10,000 a month just for the space. So she'd gotten out of that, but she basically lost money on the whole deal. So franchises are not always guaranteed to be successful, right? If you're thinking about getting into a franchise, do your research. Don't just listen to what the franchisor tells you. Don't just listen to the franchisees that they put you in touch with, because they'll put you in touch with the happy franchisees, right? Go on your own, find some other franchisees of that particular chain and ask them, how's it going? You know, are you happy with the way you're being treated by the franchisor? So do your own research. Watch out for consultants. There are people whose job it is to connect a franchisee with a franchisor, and they make money by doing that. So they'll promise you the world. They'll say, hey, this is the best opportunity ever. You're going to get in at the right time. No, they're just trying to make a commission, right? So again, do your own research. If your gut's telling you this is going to be great, do more research. But if your gut is telling you, whoa, I'm not so sure about this, do more research. Okay? Don't make just an instinctive decision on something this important. Okay, so again, in a franchise, the franchisor is the parent company. The franchisee is the local business person wanting to get in there. Why is it popular? Again, because they generally are successful and profitable, but it comes at a cost. It's a lot of work and there is some risk. All right, let's quickly talk about mergers and acquisitions and other trends. In a merger, you've got two companies coming together to become one company. In an acquisition, you have one company buying another company. So they are still coming together, but it's more of a buyer bought relationship. One's the buyer, the other one's getting bought. Whereas in a merger, they're more like equals. Okay. So whether it's a merger or an acquisition, we've got different types. We have here a flour company. I know it's a little hard to see, but if the flour company buys another flour company, this is called a horizontal merger or horizontal acquisition. They're buying a competitor. As long as they're not becoming a monopoly, they can do that. On the other hand, sometimes you might buy a customer, like a flour company might buy a baker that they sell their flour to. And when they do that, they're then keeping the baker's profits become part of their own profits, and they have a guaranteed customer, right? Because when that baker was independent, it could buy from whoever it wanted. But now that it's been bought by the flour company, it has to buy from the flour company, right? Or you could also buy your supplier. They could buy a wheat farm because that would give them more control over that supply. And the profits that the wheat farmer used to make now become the profits of the flour company. So whether you're buying your customer, which would be considered downstream on the supply chain, or your supplier, which is upstream on the supply chain, that's called a vertical acquisition. Now, a conglomerate is when you buy or merge with a company in a completely different industry. Think about, okay, Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company. They're in real estate, they own Geico, I think they have big shares in other companies as well, and lots of different industries. So it's a conglomerate. And why would you do that? Well, if one industry is going down, you're still making money from the other industries, right? So it's just like any kind of investment. When you diversify your investments, it's safer. All right. Some trends, demographic trends change. We've talked about that before. Population. In some areas, it's getting older. In some areas, it's getting younger. However, the population is changing can influence how many people want to start a business. We have, for example, some people that are in the United States that cannot legally work in the United States, but they could form a business, right? That might be an economic answer for them based on their demographic situation. So as demographics change, entrepreneurship changes. Same thing with economic changes. When the economy is doing really well, a lot of people go out and get jobs. When the economy is not doing well, people might start their own business because they can't find a job. So how do you capitalize on these trends? You need to be paying attention to what's going on, where's the opportunity out there, and if an opportunity comes along and you're in the right position, you've got the knowledge, you've got the money, you've got the connections, and you can jump on that, great. Because that opportunity might not last that long, right? This graphic over here shows that the United States we are a country where anybody can become wealthy. Anybody can become a CEO, or anybody, almost anybody, could become president, right? So there's a lot of economic mobility. However, most of the wealth is concentrated up at the top, right? So it's hard. to move up the corporate ladder, it's hard to build your own business compared to other countries. All right, with the 2 minutes we have left, I will quickly walk us through these learning objectives. So sole proprietorship, you're your own boss, right? Has pros and cons. Partnership, if you look at this picture here, we got two partners. One says there are 4 logs, the other one says there are 3. It's an optical illusion, they're actually both right, but they see it differently, right? Inherent conflict in partnerships. Corporations, the shareholders elect the board of directors who hire the officers, and the shareholders have limited liability, right? We talked about other forms of business ownership like co-ops. We talked about franchising. We talked about mergers and acquisitions. How do you bring 2 companies together and get them to function as one? Not necessarily easy. And a trend is we now have decentralized organizations like Bitcoin that has no employees, no investors, but it still functions and operates. So that's a new form of business ownership. All right, that's all we have time for. Have a good rest of the week, everybody. See you on Tuesday.